Hi everyone, my name is Kat, or the Fair Librarian. Welcome to a new video. Today I'm going to do my July wrap-up. Look at me actually filming my wrap-ups at a decent time. I don't know when this is going up, but I'm filming this in the beginning of August, so I'm going to count it as a win. But yeah, I read 15 books in August, and 5 of those were DNFs. I was a little bit slumpy, not in the way that I didn't read, but just in the way that the things that I read were not hitting. So let's get into them. Usually I go from my least favorite to my most favorite, which I will still do for the books I finished. But because I have so many DNFs, and usually it's like just what I start with, but those I will rank from the one that I DNF'd the quickest to the one that I got the furthest through before I decided not to continue. So let's dive in because we have a lot to talk about. The first DNF I had was Recipes for a Perfect Marriage by Kate Kerrigan. This one was for my TBR game, the random number generator pick, and I was already a little bit nervous going into. I wasn't sure if I was gonna like it. But I was interested in it because it's sort of like a more literary romance. It's about this woman who married this man because she was in love with the idea of love more than in love with him, and so she's now a little bit unhappy. She doesn't have like the dream marriage that she wanted and that she was expecting, and that also her grandparents have. But then she finds her grandmother's diary, which contains a lot of recipes, but also just diary entries about the beginning of her marriage. And so our main character realizes that maybe not all hope is lost, and that this fairy tale might require some more work, but it's still possible. And so it's talking about how love and relationships, they take work, and that doesn't mean that if you just try hard enough then it'll work with everyone, but that like if you want to make things work, it doesn't just happen. Like you have to actively do it. So I thought that would be interesting. My problem was it's already a little bit older. I thought it might be a little bit boring. That was not my issue though. My issue was more the writing style. Like you have those recipe websites where at the beginning you have this little introduction of how this recipe came to be. And the style really reminded me of that, so it could be intentional, but that's like fine in like a paragraph, but a whole book like that gets pretty exhausting. It's hard to get immersed in it, so I decided to DNF about 12% in. No hard feelings, just the style didn't really work for me. Then I read Third Voice by Cilla and Rolf Börjlind, which is the second book in the Rönning and Stilton thriller series. I enjoyed the first one, didn't love it, but was intrigued enough to continue, and the second book, wasn't it? Like, the main character, Olivia, just really, really annoyed me. There is a certain reveal that happens at the end of the first book that she's just so whiny about, and like is all she can think of, and she's so whiny and melodramatic about it. And then like this other character goes through something and is like, oh yeah, I know exactly how she feels because this happened to me. I'm like, no, you don't. There's like two completely different things. Like they're a completely different level. Stop complaining and whining and whatever. But yeah, because of the thing that was revealed in the last book, she decided that she no longer wants to be a police person. But she does sort of stick her nose in the case and starts to question people and actually tell them things that she's not supposed to tell them. And so the police officer in charge is like, girl, what are you doing? Like, stay away from my investigation, stay away from these witnesses, suspects, whatever. Don't tell them stuff that I don't want them to know yet because it's my investigation. So all the things that are really reasonable. And she's like, if you don't want to be a police officer, that's fine, but then don't be a police officer anymore. And then she's just like, after like, oh, she's just mad at me because I decided I don't want to be a police officer, and so I disappointed. That's why she completely lashed out at me and raged. I was like, she did not. She just told you off because you were doing things that weren't right. And it's just, she was so hurt by that, but she, like, there was nothing in it that really justified like the amount of hurt that Olivia felt over that, except for like maybe herself projecting her own feelings of that she actually wanted to be a police officer onto this other person. But then not really, because then we get the police officer POV and like it kind of confirms things in Olivia's head, and like, but that is not what spoke from this reaction. It's just it wasn't no, I didn't like it. Also, there again, which is the thing that I had with the first book, that there were too many different plot threads that didn't really come together in any sort of way, and I could see with the setup that was happening that was going to be the case again, or likely going to be the case again. And I decided that I was going to move on from this book and from this series, so I DNF'd a little over a quarter of the way through. Then, the most devastating DNF on this list is Second Chance Pass by Robyn Carr, which is the 5th book in the Virgin River series. I really, really love this series, or at least the first 4 books in this series, but I just could not with how these characters were acting in this one. So our 2 main characters are Vanessa and Paul, and it's their romance. And so Vanessa was married to Paul's best friend, Matt, but Matt ended up dying whilst Vanessa was pregnant, and so Paul really supported her during the pregnancy and a little bit after that, both like helping her with more practical things and supporting her during the pregnancy, but also just emotionally, and that's how they kind of got closer. And we have a bit of a second chance romance because Paul has actually always had a crush on Vanessa, but like then his best friend came in and kind of stole her. Like, he never like voiced his interest in Vanessa, so it's not the friend's fault necessarily, but then it was like, okay, now I can't pursue that anymore. So yeah, we have that. Most of the conflict comes from love triangle-ish situations, but I think it's a very interesting take on a love triangle because they're both involved in something that resembles it, but it's not quite the trope. So Paul, right before the beginning of the book, he has casual sex with this woman, and that results in the woman being pregnant, or at least so we're told. As a side note, like, the moment she had the conversation, like, I'm pregnant, I didn't believe it. I was like, this baby does not exist, and she's just saying that. And there was nothing that, like, every moment that woman spent on page only confirmed that suspicion. I haven't gotten far enough to have like definitive conclusions on that, but I'm pretty sure that that's what's going on, that she's not actually pregnant. But that is a side note. So she's like, I'm pregnant, we should get married, whatever. And so Paul is like, no, I'm not going to do that, because one, we both agreed this was going to be casual. Two, we don't love each other in that way. And if we marry, that will only make you unhappy, that'll make me unhappy, and that'll make this child unhappy. I am going to be a dad to this child, I'm going to take my responsibility, whatever. But I'm not going to marry you. And so she is really hurt by that, and she does some really weird things throughout the book to sort of try and let this marry thing happen after all. But Paul keeps like firmly saying, like, no, I want to support you in this, but nothing more than that. And then Vanessa, on her end, she is also sort of wrapped up in a semi-love triangle, because the mother of her late husband, or mother-in-law, is sort of like, it's time for you to move on with your life. Here's this random dude you've never seen before, but that I kind of like, marry him. And she's like, I don't want that. And so she also firmly says to this guy, Cameron is his name, also firmly says to him, like, I don't want to marry you. But like, Cameron just won't take no for an answer and keeps doing things to sort of make it appear as if Vanessa and he are closer and more involved than they actually are. And so we sort of have a love triangle that Paul and Cameron are kind of jealous of one each other, and they think that it's a love triangle, but Vanessa from the get-go told Cameron, like, no, I am not interested in you in that way. I don't want to be your girlfriend. We could be friends if you want, but nothing more than that is going to happen. And then the reverse also, that this woman that is pregnant with Paul's baby, or maybe not pregnant, but she's just pregnant. She also like, is it because there's another woman? I knew there was another woman. And she's like really jealous, and then she always also like wraps it up to be a love triangle. And then as soon as Vanessa finds out that this woman exists and that whatever, then she also thinks that Paul is involved with this woman more than this. And so we have this sort of situation where like the two people at the end think that it's a love triangle, but the one in the middle is like clearly not, and has always to one direction, giving a very clear indication from the get-go that they're not interested in them romantically. So I thought that was kind of like a fun take on this whole trope. But then a certain scene happened. I'm gonna say I DNF'd about 37% of the way through. So the thing that I'm going to talk about is like, say, 30 to 37% mark is like the when these things are happening, because it's a few scenes. So if you don't want to hear that, skip to the next book. There'll be timestamps in the description. So it starts by Cameron calling Vanessa saying, hey, how about we go to like the beach this weekend? Like, I'll book a hotel and then you come with me and like we spend the weekend together, and like you can take your child with you, because like I know you're a single mom with a young child, so like you can take your son with you and like it'll be fun. And Vanessa's like, yeah, how about no? And then Paul calls her and he's like, hey, can we talk? Because before that point, he's also sort of tried to say that, you know, there was this woman that is pregnant to Vanessa, but it's so unnecessarily clumsily and just so... If you don't like the miscommunication trope, that scene's gonna be rough for you. Oh my god. Because there's so many opportunities where it just could have said how it was, but it did not. And he's like, I didn't have an opportunity. It's like, yes, you did, but whatever. And so he's like, okay, no, we really need to talk. It's important, but I don't want to say it over the phone. So is it okay if I come to Virgin River this weekend to, you know, talk about this? And she's like, yeah, sure, whatever. She hangs up. And then she's like, I don't want to talk to him. So instead of just calling him back and saying, hey, no, I don't want to talk to you, actually. I don't want you to come. She calls Cameron and says like, hey, is that offer for like this weekend still a thing? And so like, I do want a separate room, but like we can totally do it. And so Cameron's like, yeah, sure. So they go to the sea together. Paul arrives at Vanessa's house because he's also staying there, because when he's in Virgin River, he usually stays there. He arranged it with Vanessa's dad because Vanessa lives with her dad. And so it's like, hey, where's Vanessa? And like the dad's like, yeah, she's not here. She went out with this guy. And he's like, so what? Because they kind of met up there, but or decided to meet up there, but whatever. So Paul stays for the weekend. At the end of the weekend, Cameron and Vanessa return, and so Paul is like waiting for her at her house, and so Cameron gets super jealous, like, there's a man, you didn't tell me there's another man, because if I would have known, like, I would have known that you and I weren't going to happen, and then I could have given up hope, but you're giving me false hope, and you've lied to me. And I'm like, no, she did not. She told you right away that she wasn't interested in you like that. At that point, whether or not she has a boyfriend is completely irrelevant, because she told you that she is not interested. Multiple times. Very clearly, very directly, very unambiguously. Granted, going to this weekend with you was kind of mixed signals, but it's not like she's never told you before that she doesn't want to be involved with you. Anyway, but like, they get this huge argument. Vanessa is like very defensive, like, no, it's not what you think, blah, 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 we're not really in a relationship. And like, shut up, it doesn't matter, because you don't want to be in a relationship with him anyway, like you said many times. Who cares? Whatever. So Cameron drives off. Paul and Vanessa have this talk, and so he's like, yeah. And he tells out what it's like how this woman, and they get Vanessa's inner monologue, because it's still from her POV, and like, Oh, I always forget like how easy these types of things are men, because women could never. Never mind the fact that like in order to have casual sex between a man and a woman, that does mean that a woman needs to engage in that, but whatever. Like women could never, but like for men this is so easy. And like stuff like that, and like it goes on like that a little bit. And so, and then the last thing I read is like Paul said like, oh yeah, but she said she took her pill and I used a condom, so I'm gonna get some tests done because there's a possibility that I'm not the father. And then the reaction from Vanessa Jet is, oh my god, like you really couldn't keep your pants on, could you? Or like something along those lines. I'm like, how is that your reaction to this guy saying that this unborn baby, of which you've known about for 2 pages by this point, because the conversation has gone on for that long, how is that your reaction at this point? At him saying, it might not be mine. If that implies anything, it implies that this woman couldn't keep her pants on. Because if she's really pregnant, which Vanessa has no reason to assume that it's not true, and Paul says it might not be mine, that means that this woman would have had to have sex with her man in order to get pregnant. So like, why is she mad at him for that at that point in time? And just at that, I could not anymore. Yeah, I just stopped. I'm really sad because I love this series so far, but that was just too much. So I did it. I've been talking about this book for a long time. I have strong feelings, oh my gosh. On to the next one, which is The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides, which is a psychological thriller about this woman who has murdered her husband but hasn't spoken since, and this psychiatrist who thinks that he can solve the case, get her to speak again, whatever. I was really a little bit nervous because I'd read The Maidens by him, which I didn't think was very good, but I at least was entertained by him. And I heard from a lot of people that also didn't like The Maidens that like The Silent Patient is definitely his better book. So I didn't want to give it a chance. And I don't get it. I thought this was so bland. Like when Theo, our main character, was actually working on the case, it was like semi-interesting. And I was semi-intrigued, but not necessarily because the writing itself was intriguing, but just of the concept itself. There was no point in the book where I was any more intrigued than I was after just reading the back description before I started reading it. So that's just, yeah, it's like the setup was the source of all intrigue for me. Then there were also like these diary entries. I didn't care about that. We had Theo had some marriage drama, which I didn't care about. So I was just so bored. Like, I can see that it's probably slightly better written than The Maidens, but at least The Maidens was entertaining, which this wasn't. So I stopped reading. 38% in I wrote down, which I'm impressed that I got that for. Because yeah, this wasn't it. And the final DNF, the one that I got 70% of the way through before I decided to DNF, is I Run Flame by Rebecca Yarros. So book 1 was not perfect, but I had fun with it. I had some issues with it, but that was not necessarily what bothered me. So I'd heard a lot of criticisms from book 2, Run Flame, that it's not that good and that it should have gotten more time and that it just was published too early and that's why it was so bad. I don't think that it needed more time. I think that it needed to use the time that it had in a different way. Because this book is split up into part 1 and part 2. And I don't think that those two parts should have been part of the same book. I think if this book would have been only part 1, that would be a great book. And then the time that was spent on writing part 2 could have been spent polishing part 1 a little bit more, because it felt very rough. And that's where like the not enough time comes in, because if it had more time to breathe and to be edited, I think it could have been a lot better. And then what is now part 2 could have been like the third book. That way some pacing issues would be solved. Both parts got a bit more time to breathe and a bit more time to get edited. If you really have this time pressure in publishing. And also just part 3 was just so boring. I did not care. I listened to the audiobook for this one, and I just noticed that my mind was wandering and I would miss like half an hour in the audiobook. And I was like, oh, I missed it. Yeah, I don't care. So I thought at the end, like, maybe I should just give up, because I'm already missing half the story anyway. So yeah, I DNF'd it. Then the books that I actually did finish. Let's start with The Chain by Adrian McKinty. So I had heard that this book, it's also split in 2 parts, and that like sort of the consensus of this was that part 1 is really good, part 2 is really bad. So what I was kind of looking forward to in part 2 was like a really poorly written, kind of entertaining mess that like you can like roll your eyes at and like have a fun rant about it, and you know, like a train wreck that you can't look away from type of deal. Yeah, no, that wasn't it. So I'll tell you what this book is about. So it's about this woman and her child get kidnapped, and she gets a message saying like, you're now part of the chain, so in order to get your child back you have to pay this amount of money, and then kidnap their child, and then the cycle repeats. So part 1 is sort of this woman trying to deal with the situation, and then part 2 is sort of when her part of the chain is over, like trying to take them down. And like part 2 had these constant flashbacks that really broke the tension that I didn't care about. There was just like tragic backstory to the person who was behind it. And like I didn't care. I didn't think they added much, and it just broke the tension. Like I just want to see like the scheming to take them down. I don't want to see what their childhood was like, you know. Also, there were a few things with the people behind it that you know, like the fact that they were the only queer character in the book felt a little iffy. Also, it sort of plays into the very problematic asexual psychopath thing. Not a spoiler, because like you don't know this, only like in the context of where you get their POV, so that is not necessarily a spoiler for there, but like it really played into that, which totally rubbed me the wrong way. And so yeah, like I really did not like part 2. Part 1 I thought was fine, but nothing more than that. So I gave it 1.5 star. I don't think it was very good. Like the author thought there were certain parts in part 2 that the author just thought he was being so clever. And like he was trying to like explain his own metaphor. It's like, yeah, your metaphor was like so obvious from the get-go, you did not need to explain that. So yeah, I don't know. I didn't like it. I don't recommend it. Then, slightly better, but also not really good, is The Last Dragon King by Leah Stone. This is a fantasy romance where the Dragon King, so he's like, you can sort of shapeshift between his human form and his dragon form. But in order to have children, he needs a person who has enough magic in their blood too, because else they will just die. And this Dragon King really, really wants children. So he sort of rounds up every young woman in the kingdom that has enough magic, and they sort of like the selection type of deal, where he wants to choose his bride. That is a setup. Things change from there. But yeah, that is the setup. We follow our main character, Arwen. Like the same name as like the Lord of the Rings character. And they go to a city called Jade City. There is a chosen one called the King Killer. There's another character called Annabeth, like the same name as like the character from Percy Jackson. And there is the fake king is called Lucien, like the character from ACOTAR. And I'm like, what is it with like everything in this book having the same name as like something in a major fantasy series? Like, it was really distracting. And I don't think they were supposed to be references, because the things had like nothing in common with the thing that shared their name. So like that was weird, and I think like, okay, maybe Jade City was mentioned on the back. That was like the name of the capital. But I was like, okay, that's kind of a funny thing, because like it's a YA fantasy romance. Like if you're more in that sphere, maybe you like know that this book exists, but like when you hear Jade City, it doesn't immediately have this association with it. So like that can happen on accident. It was just so much, and like I can't believe that like no one noticed this, like any of this. And it was so distracting, and it was weird. It was so weird. Also, just the story was very underdeveloped, like every aspect. The plot underdeveloped, the world underdeveloped. Like it felt like we had the town where Arwen had come from, then we had the Jade City, and then we had like this other town where this one random character was from. And like, as far as I know, that we're the only 3 towns in the entire kingdom. There was a map at the beginning that only had those 3 towns on it. And it was like, man, this world is like, feels so tiny. It was really underdeveloped. The characters were as flat as they could be. The romance was very underdeveloped. Also just like, it's sort of we get sort of like, they're become friends first, and then we get the romance. And it's like, we're really good friends. Like, yeah, we've never really seen you spend time together though. You're just telling me that you're really good friends. We've seen maybe one conversation that was not a positive one, but I don't see that you're friends. So yeah, it wasn't very good. It went quickly, I'll give it that, but yeah, no, I don't really recommend it. I also not going to continue on the series. So yeah. Then I read The Assassin's Blade by Sarah J. Maas. This is sort of the prequel short stories that are part of the Throne of Glass series, and there's a lot of discussion of when you're supposed to read this. I feel like the 2 main camps are as the very first one or as a third one. I can sort of see arguments for both or against both. I read it as third, and I think I'm happy with that. But yeah, I just think that this book wasn't fully necessary. Like, I could have done without it. That is mainly the thing. I had fun with some of the stories, but not all of them. But to me, it almost felt like a side quest, because I'd gotten invested in the main plot of the series, and so we're just like looking at these random episodes in Selena's life before the series even starts, and I just don't know if they added a whole lot. Like, I didn't hate them, I didn't have a bad time reading them. I also we had some more world building, which I enjoyed because I like world building. There are a lot of things sort of set up that are gonna come back in the main series. There's been one or two things that I already had encountered, but there's so much more that I'm like, okay, I bet that this is gonna be relevant, or I bet that this character is gonna return, or whatever. And so I think that just the potential for it to be really like this tie back, and this like, oh yeah, I read about that type of deal. I think I enjoyed that too. But the book itself I could have done without. Also, it is like, I think it's 5 different stories, but it's like just one kind of big stories, because they just follow each other pretty closely. You know, it's more like one that I'm more happy that I have read it than I was reading it necessarily. I gave it 3.5 stars. I didn't hate it. I had fun throughout, like with some of the stories I really enjoyed. But I didn't need it at all. Then I read Träume, einer neuen Zeit by Marie Lamballe, which is the second book in the Atelier Rosen series. I read the first book in January and I quite enjoyed it. This one has a bit of a mystery element to it, because we have a character who has stolen something. I can't say what they stole because that is kind of like a spoiler for book 1, but this thing is stolen, and the owner of the thing is very convinced that this one person did it, and so our main character Elise is trying to sort of get close to him to get this thing back, and to really figure out if he did it. But there's also semi kind of romance involved, and you know, it was fun. It was still like just like a feel good time, not too difficult, not to you know, like a fun time. I think the main issue that I have with this, and that I also had with book 1, is that this is an adult series, but it reads very YA, and actually like a young YA. Like, the writing has that naivety to it that YA tends to have. These characters act extremely young, even though I think Elise is supposed to be 18 years old, but she doesn't act like an 18-year-old. She feels very young. Moritz, who is sort of like, he's the son of someone who works at the hat atelier, and so they've known each other since they were children, and Moritz is really convinced that they're gonna marry someday, and like the way he goes about that also feels very juvenile and childish. Now he keeps insisting and stuff, and I would have given this book a 4 stars, if it was a YA book, but it's not. And I don't think that as an adult book, I can give it that high of a rating. So I gave it 3.5. I did like it though. Nothing exceptional by any means, but you know, like just a fun palate cleanser type of read. So then I read The Wings of Ashtaroth by Hugh Westenra. I plan to do a whole separate video review for this book. But I can tell you that I really enjoyed this. This is an epic fantasy that is sort of inspired by the conflict between ancient Carthage and Rome. So we mainly follow this royal family of this kingdom or empire. I'm not entirely sure anymore. Anyway, like this country, and sort of in the prologue, the family gets cursed, and we see how they're dealing with that and how like they're falling apart and stuff like that. The prologue was insanely good. It might be one of the best prologues I've read in my entire life. And then it like started a little bit slow, but I like that because we had like a lot of great world building. The character development was pretty good, and then when it got going, it went really fast. Maybe a little bit too fast for me. But like it really got going. My main issue with this book though is that it's insanely long. Like on Goodreads it says it's like 1,500 pages. I had an ebook edition of it, and you know, like when you change the font settings, the page count goes up. Because it was also like around that, but the font was just really tiny, so I changed it to like a readable size, and then it was like 2,200 something, which is just a very long time to have to spend with them, and I am a person who gets burnt out on a story after a while. Like I can really enjoy a book, but if it goes on for too long, I just grow tired of like the world and the characters and the plot, and I need to read something else, and then I can come back to it. That's also why I'm not a series binger. Like I would like to read at least one thing in between installments of the same series, and so by the end of it I did feel that. So yeah, I'm not sure if I'm gonna read book 2. Will depend on how long book 2 is, because I thought it was very interesting, and it felt a little bit you know how like the Grace of Kings is sort of prologue, and then you have the rest of the series, like the main series. I don't know how book 2 is gonna go, so maybe I'm wrong, but like the way it is written, it kind of feels like it could be a similar situation. But yeah, I did enjoy it. I do recommend it if you don't have the long book fatigue that I sometimes have. So yeah, that is The Wings of Ashtaroth. I'm gonna do a separate video, or at least plan to do one at some point with a standalone review for this. Then we're almost near the end. So we're almost there, but I read A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. I had read this book when I was like 15, but I didn't really remember it. So it felt like reading it for the first time. And I was surprised at how much I enjoyed it. Like I thought I would like it, but I thought it would be like okay, this was cool, but I actually actively enjoyed some parts, so that is cool. I liked the setup. The first like bit is like pretty much entirely set up, but I didn't mind that. I like the world building. Like, it's not the most intricate and the most complex and stuff, but it is like enough to follow the story, and you get what you need, and I like the way that was done. I really enjoyed Feyre and Tamlin's relationship in the series. I know that from what I've heard, that opinion will change in book 2. But yeah, I also like Nesta. She gets a lot of hate, I feel, but I liked her. I think that Feyre just has a very negative perception of her. But if like there's actually dialogue that she's talking and stuff, if you read between the lines, like you notice that that version of Nesta is quite different from like the version of Nesta that Feyre has built up in her head. And so maybe, you know, she's a bit more nuanced than we think at first, and I really enjoyed that. I gave this book 4 stars. I had a fun time with it, and I really want to read book 2. Then I read an entire comic series. It was only 3 volumes, but I read all 3 this month, so I'm going to talk them together, and that is Les Artilleuses by Pierre Pevel and Étienne Willem. So this is about these 3 women. One is an enchantress, one is a fairy, and one is a human, and they do heists together, and they're thieves and whatever. And it's set in a sort of magical version of Paris at the beginning of the 20th century. So very steampunk vibes. And we start off with them stealing, they get an assignment to steal a certain thing that sort of sets off all these politics, and you know, like people are hunting them down because they want this thing, and they get wrapped up in something that is a lot bigger than they may have expected. So I really enjoyed it. It's very fast paced, and a lot of tension. I really like that. It's like a very cartoonish art style, which I thought was a lot of fun, with like the steampunk vibes, as I already said, and just, you know, I really like this style. We have a bit of found family with 3 main characters, which I enjoyed. I'm looking at my notes. What else I wrote down? Yeah, like fun politics. In the 3rd album, though, there were a couple of very uncomfortable images where they were very male gazy, like a lot of boob for no reason. That I didn't love. Like, there was in the second one, there was also one scene where it was like, okay, like you chose to do it, but it was like kind of getting there, but like not quite there yet, to the point where I really had a problem with it. The 3rd one, I did have a problem with some of the images, so didn't love that. But other than that, I had a lot of fun. The 3rd one had like these 2 police officers who were like totally just comic relief characters, and I shouldn't think they were funny, but I kind of did. So yeah, as I said, it's very fast paced. In times it feels a little bit rushed, but I did have fun with it. So I think I gave the first two 4.5 stars, and the third one I gave 4 stars. So. And then the last book that I have, my favorite book of the month of July, is The Honeys by Ryan Laswella, which was the very first book I finished of the month. So yeah, my expectations were really high and it didn't disappoint. We had a fun plot, which it just so many twists and turns, and every time I thought I knew what we were doing, it would change and there would be something different. So that was fun. Parts of the book felt a bit like a fever dream, but like in a good way. And I could feel just a summer heat in it. Like the suffocating heat that just created a very good atmosphere for the horror. And just like the themes also just were so beautiful, like to find someone who loves you for you and accepts you for you and finding a place where you belong, I thought was really beautiful. There was one moment where I cried a little bit. I loved it so much. I realize I haven't said what it's about. So we have our main character, Mars, who is gender fluid. And he and his twin sister would always go to this particular summer camp. But something has happened there, which we don't know what. We learn that further on in the book. That made him no longer want to go. But his sister kept going and really liked it, and she became friends with this group of girls who call themselves the Honeys. And they're pretty mysterious and whatever, but the name the Honeys is involved with the fact that they do like beekeeping in this summer camp, but they're sort of like semi part of it but not fully part of it. It's a weird dynamic. I don't know. I have, just from reading a few books and watching some stuff, I feel like summer camp in the US works very different from summer camp that I know. Or else it's just like the way that people chose to portray it in those media, but I don't know, it was weird to me. I don't understand, but whatever. We have Mars, who they tell him like, hey, you have to be, we try not to mix, so you are gonna have to go in the boys' cabin. So like, I hope you don't mind. And he's like, no, I don't mind. I'm gender fluid, which means like I'm all the genders. So like boy also is part of that. I'm just not only that. Something along those lines. And we sort of have this thing where the boys from his cabin are immensely bigoted, I guess, and just not okay. And they keep doing things and saying things and being very discriminatory against him. And then there are other things that like they say something that is actually kind of like, oh no, I'm so sorry, I wouldn't want you to like be offended by that. And he's like, I'm not offended, like you didn't say anything offensive, like don't try to make me out like something who's totally oversensitive. But then these other things that I would do that like is very offensive, like they wouldn't care. And so we have like the Honeys that he first things are kind of suspicious, because the reason he goes back to the summer camp is because his sister ends up dying at the beginning of the book. And he wants to know what happens, and he wants to sort of get close to the honeys to find some answers, because there are some weird things surrounding her death. But he finds, like, he does find acceptance, and he does belong. And I just thought that was very beautiful, the way that happened. There's some scary stuff in there and some really weird stuff too, but also some really beautiful stuff. So yeah, that was my month. I managed to keep this under an hour, which I'm really proud of. So yeah, let me know if you've read any of these books, what you thought of it. Also, let me know what your favorite book was that you read in the month of July, and I will see you again in another video. Bye!